Scotland, we've got the link there, is where you actually find the contract notices. And that applies obviously not just for this contract, but for any other contracts across the Scottish public sector. We'll go in very quickly just to show you how to find the contract, but in fact, most of the registration of interest, getting the documents, will be on the next system. So if you just move on, please, Elizabeth. So for anyone who is totally new to public procurement in Scotland, and this is maybe the first tender that you've done, you will have to register on Public Contracts Scotland, and there's a small tab on the right-hand side, and you need to register as a supplier, not as a buyer. And this will give you access to all the tender notices coming out from about 900 plus organisations across Scotland. So obviously Renfrewshire Care at Home housing support is the one that you're interested in today, but it could well be that there's other local authorities, for example, and this is where you'll find their notices coming through as well. Next slide, please. The registration process is very straightforward, no different probably to sort of online shopping type arrangements. The one thing just to be a little bit wary of for this and for Public Contracts Scotland tender is make sure when you're registering to try to have a generic email. So maybe not info at, but tenders at, procurement at, something like that, because make sure that that can go to one or more people. When these notices come through and so on, if it's only with one person and they leave, for example, that's not good. But obviously, if they're on holiday or something like that, you might be missing important notices. The form's very straightforward. I've highlighted with the arrows here a couple of slightly odd ones. There's a NUTS code to fill in, which is purely a regional one. And you are asked if you're third sector, and I know that may apply for some of you today. You can tick that box. It won't in any way affect the number of notices you get through or whether you can apply for anything or not. So it's purely for information. Okay, and then you just submit the details from there. Next slide, please. So once you're registered, you then come to try and find the Renfrewshire contract and see what the details are there. For quite a few contracts, you can put in some keywords, maybe put in the buyer and try to search that way if it's not already coming through your alerts. And this is quite good. I've put on the right-hand side here some details, maybe less for today's session, but if you're interested, say, in care at home type opportunities and you want to know maybe what's open, so that's the first bullet, contract notices, anything where you can still respond. Or you might want to look at, for the second bullet, contract awards, and that can give you some very valuable information on who's winning the contracts, who's on what they call frameworks, which is maybe more a group of suppliers, a sort of approved list. And that can give you some very helpful information, really, who's getting that work, what the values are. And you might also see some awards for what we call quick quotes, which is perhaps smaller pieces of work. The value here would be less than 50,000. And the final bullet for things that you can find through these general searches is the prior information notice. Again, that's very useful. So I imagine possibly Renfrewshire Council might have put out one of these just to alert the market that a tender is coming up. But it's particularly commonly used where the buyer perhaps also wants to send out a survey to prospective bidders or ask for your input maybe on how the tender should be structured and put into lots. So keep an eye out for these PIN notices too. In terms of finding this contract, however, next slide please, Elizabeth. I'd recommend that you use the search for buyer function, and you can see that it's just highlighted in a little blue box on that command bar at the top on the PCS page. The search for buyer screen lets you put in the buyer you're looking for. So here, Renfrewshire Council, you click on the search for buyers, And on the right, it'll bring up either the one organisation, or in this case, there's a few that have Renfrewshire Council in them. And the middle one's the one we're looking for, and you would click on that, which is a live link to take you through to the buyer profile. Next slide, please. The buyer profile has a number of tabs. So again, today we'd be looking for the current contract notices, but you can see to the right of that future notices, which is the pins. There's past notices. Further down on the next buttons, there's the award notices and contracts register. Again, a list of what contracts are in place. So you can always open these up at another time and use it for research, if you like, into particular buyers. So the third one on this list is the one that we're looking for. And if you look just to the left of that arrow pointing towards the flexible framework, you can see a little icon. It's kind of a box with an arrow coming out of it. And that tells us that the tender is not going to be administered on Public Contract Scotland portal, but it's going to send you to the PCS tender portal for submission. So that icon's useful to watch for. So clicking on to flexible framework link will take you to the next screen. That's next slide, please. And at this point, this blue box at the top will tell you very clearly that you need to go to PCS tender to register. I've circled there the live link, which could already take you to the next portal. Again, this is a completely different system altogether. But before you do that, you need to do a couple of things. The first one is you need to make a note of the project code, which you'll see it says, please search for project code 24827 under, and then it says ITTs open to all suppliers. So ITT stands for Invitation to Tenders Open to All Suppliers. So make a note of that 24827 code, because it's going to help you find the actual tender documents once you move across to the other system. The other thing I would recommend that you do, and I suspect probably most of you at this stage may already have done this, the tender's been out for a little while. I can't remember, maybe it was towards the end of December. But at this point, you can still, within PCST, read through the full notice text, just where that arrow is at the bottom. This is quite helpful, I think, rather than plunging straight into the tender documents, because it will give an overview. It will tell you the value, in this case, that it's a flexible framework. So that's a framework where normally a framework would last for 4 years and you either get onto it or you don't. Flexible framework, you've maybe seen from some of the previous sessions, will be reopened. So if you don't get through for this contract notice, this one's got a deadline of February, it will be opened up again. So the full notice text will tell you a bit about that. It will give you some values, but importantly, it will tell you something about what they call the selection criteria. And those are some of the requirements that are basically mandatory pass-fail requirements. On this tender, that includes issues such as obviously Care Inspectorate, and there's a quality level 3 that's set as a minimum. You need to be certified for certain types of services. I think in this case, again, there's a joint care at home housing support requirement. It will talk about the qualifications required for your staff. So all of those things, it's good to read in advance, because for some people, it might not be that you have those in place at the moment. And I can see from some of the Q&A and some of the previous tender presentations that have been done, and the tender documents, that there is a possibility, to make sure they're done by the time you submit your tender, and/or to apply later if you don't have what's needed. So at this point, we're still in PCS. I would read that full notice text, and then I would click on the PCS tender link to take you to the other portal. Next slide, please.
Jill, can you just have a wee look at the questions just before we move on to the next slide? I think there was something popped in. Sorry, I can see them popping in, but I can't now read them for you.
Okay.
I'm sharing.
Get in the chat. Right. I'm just having a look to see. I can't see anything coming up quite yet on the chat for mine, but let me see. Okay. I'll keep an eye on that, Elizabeth, just
That's great. Thanks, Jill.
as we go through. So just the next slide, please. That's great. So just very quickly, PCS tender, it's been in place for quite some time, but not as long as the main PCS portal. Effectively, it's a system that links into other back office functionality, if you like, that's used in the public sector, which is why it was needed a little bit over and above the PCS portal, which is a bit limited. It is a different site, so you do need to register separately if you haven't done so, but it is free and the registration process is very straightforward. What PCS tender does is to include all the, if you like, it's like filling in an online questionnaire, whereas with PCS, what you tend to have to do is prepare all your documents separately and then upload it. And PCST also has what they call the single procurement document. And this is, if you like, the first stage of any tenders where you have to pre-qualify. And that's where these selection criteria that I mentioned, all of those questions will be there. I've seen the question, Lorna, that's come in about the framework being reopened. I couldn't see anything in the tender documents for that as yet, so that's probably a good question to put back through the PCS portal if you can. Sometimes the buyers won't commit necessarily to that until they see what the response is to the first call, if you like, whereas others maybe state it's 3 months, 6 months, once a year and so on. Next slide, please, Elizabeth. So this is the homepage for PCST. The registration is just on the left-hand side there where you see the orange button. And again, you register as a supplier, fill in the forms, you get your password sorted out. You can, in fact, link your PCS and PCST logins if you want. You can do that through the main PCS portal, which is the first one we looked at. Next slide, please. So once you've registered, when you do log in, you get to this kind of home screen, if you like, with the 3 blocks. On the right-hand side has Manage My Profile. So if you've not used PCST before, you can, if you like, start to fill in some details on that side. It'll have your main registration data. Or you can wait until you bid for your first project, i.e. this one, and then a lot of the information that you fill in will drop back into your profile. But it's just useful to know that that's there. You can change your password there, and you can also manage users if there's more than one of you want to use your PCS tender account at any one time. On the left-hand side then for the projects, in this case, we've been directed to the ITT's Open to All Suppliers. So it's the ITT Invitation to Tender button that you need to press here. The next slide, please. So when you do that, you'll automatically come into this ITT's Open to All Suppliers area. What you'll probably find at that point, you can see here, I think I did this screenshot a couple of days ago already. This is showing like 111 open tenders on PCST. And annoyingly, I've not ever worked out why it gives you the tender title, but it doesn't tell you who the buyer is. So it's very difficult to trawl your way through and make sure you find the right one. So in this case, we'll use the filter box, which is just underneath. And we're going to use the project code then to filter down to the right tender. Next slide, please. So the filter box, when you open it up, you get a list of criteria. So if you choose project code, you get a list of what they call operators. So I would normally choose the contains, and then you type in your 24827 code and then click on search. and then that will bring up, if you just see down below, the proper, and you can check the project code, that gives us the proper title for the tender, and then you can click on that link, which is a live link, to take you through to the next stage. Next slide, please. So a bit, the format and the screens are a bit horrible. I would say this system was developed, I think, back in the 1970s or 80s. So when you do open it up, if it is your first time, don't be too daunted. You can't break anything or, you know, get yourself taken out of the tender system. But some of the screens that you see in full can be a little bit busy. So we've clicked on the title. The first thing you need to do on the right hand side is express an interest. And once you do that, that will take you to the next stage where you can start to look at the actual documents and get ready to fill in your response. Good. Next slide, please, Elizabeth. So the next stage, you'll see the title at the top, and then you'll see some headings. So I've highlighted here the first of the headings, ITT details. And underneath that, this is where you're going to get all the information that you need to read in order to find out about the tender and all the questionnaires that you need to fill in. So the first tab here is settings. Don't tend to look at that, I have to say, but it will confirm the deadlines. You know, if the deadline changes maybe as we're going through, the settings will give you the definitive deadline date and time. The next tab is very, very important. So this is the buyer attachments. And here you can see there's 31 different documents, which already tells you quite a lot of work to read through these. And I can't really emphasize enough, you must read through all of these documents carefully before you even start to fill in the My Response documents. There'll be elements there, and we'll just have a quick look in a future slide, but typically what I'd be looking for first of all is an invitation to tender document, things like information for bidders, instructions, anything like that, read first, and then work your way down through all the other documents to make sure that you clearly understand them. The My Response, we're going to have a look at this when we go to the online demo, but that typically on PCS tender has 3 sections. So the first part is the qualification part, the single procurement document, which I've mentioned before. That's where you will have information on your sort of basic information, if you like, on your organisation. You'll be asked if you're bidding with other people or subcontracting, so that's going to be important to add. Quite a big long list of, in part 3, the what we would call the exclusions. So it starts off with some of the mandatory ones, you know, criminal activity, are you a terrorist, you know, are sort of, have you committed fraud? So all the very serious ones where you have to self-certify yes or no that you haven't. And then some of the other, what they call discretionary. So maybe you've had some employment tribunals to deal with. Have you had any health and safety, maybe improvement notices? So those ones, if you have to tick yes, you won't be excluded automatically, but you will have to put in what they call self-cleaning evidence. So what was it that you've done or you're doing as an organisation to make sure it doesn't happen again? So that part 3 of qualification, very long, but most of the answers will be either no or yes, and you can move on to the next section. The part 4 section of the qualification, that requires a bit more information and a bit more input. In particular, the first question will ask you about membership of certain trade professional bodies. The next question is asking for examples, and there's a template there of relevant projects, 2 relevant projects, and you'll need to put in a 1-page description of each of those. So that already needs a bit of planning. Make sure that you're choosing the best projects to match what Renfrewshire Council are looking for. And then there's another request for staff qualifications and any qualifications or certifications, accreditations of the organisation. So that part of we're still in the qualification here, requires quite a bit of just organisation. It won't be information that you don't have already, but just to be looked at and completed. The next section, the technical section, is clearly where all the scoring sits. So provided that you've passed qualification, the evaluators will then look at your technical response. And it's a combination of, there's 3 technical questions, which we'll come on to when we look at the live demo. 1 question on community benefits and 1 question on fair work practice. And in particular for the technical questions 1 to 3, you're also asked to provide supporting evidence and upload descriptions, further details, or examples of documents. So again, all of this will have been described in full detail on the buyer attachment documents, so that when you open the forms up, you should already be knowing what to look for and knowing what the buyers are looking for. I notice in particular, for example, there's an instruction to try and submit documents in Word or Excel rather than PDF format. Okay, so we'll come back to the actual how you get into those and how they look on the screen when we do the demo. And then the final tab on the functions is the adding other users. So again, if there's others in your organisation, it might be a good idea to add those, or within a small organisation, if you're all working carefully together, you can share your login, but be careful, because if 2 of you log in at the same time, it might be that as other people are saving, as you go through, it's cancelling out. I've had that with one customer. Somebody was busy filling in the forms and somebody in the next room was literally on the other room saving another part, and it literally just cancelled out whatever the other person was doing. Next slide, please. Okay, so just coming back to the buyer attachments, this is the start of the list. So you'll see they're numbered sort of 1 to 31 on the left, but be careful to notice that Renfrewshire have also given numbers themselves in the title. So any reference to, I'm trying to think of one, I think it's Appendix 17 for the project examples, that will mean the council's number 17, not 17 on the list. With 31 documents, to be honest, I think the easiest way is to click on the mass download document option rather, and that will save and download the file as a zip file, and you can then extract it and move it into the folder where you're doing all your tender work. Next slide, please. So the My Response tab, when you click on that at the higher level, there is an initial command where you're asked to intend to respond. So if you could click that, if you decline to respond, it'll literally just take you back and you might be asked why you're declining. So I would kind of ignore that one. It's absolutely okay to intend to respond. You might get halfway through the forms and suddenly think, you know, we can't do this. You can then either go back and decline or just choose not to submit. So there's no issues, there's no problems in at least opening it up to get started. Another thing, which I hope you can see it on the screen here, to the left of decline to respond, there's a little command with 3 small dots. I use this all the time, to be honest. I use it when I first start with the tender, because if you click on that, it will give you a PDF version of everything: qualification, technical, commercial response. So almost exactly as you would see it on the screen. And I quite like that because I can email that to people without asking them to come in and out of the portal. So they can have a look at the bit that applies to them and provide you with the information. Next slide, please. So just going back to where we were on the functions, there was an ITT tab, and then the other tab is messages, which is all to do with asking questions throughout the tender process. And I think hopefully most of you will understand you can only ask questions via the portal now that the tender has been published. Particularly if you're working with the council already, it's not possible to approach any of the people on the team in the council that you're working with. Everything has to go through the portal. The questions will be answered, and when the answers go back, the buyer won't be revealing who's asked the question, and you shouldn't put your name or anything else that can identify you in the question either. The buyer can see who's asking. Occasionally, and I have seen this, maybe if you've got something that's highly confidential that you don't, for good reasons if you like, don't want to be shared, you can occasionally ask if something can be responded to on a one-to-one basis. And I have seen that done, but it's done because it's not something that's going to affect or limit or give you, if you like, favoured information versus everybody else. As a general tip, please don't be frightened to ask questions. We're often asked, we were in tend work on a daily basis, really, with lots of companies bidding for lots of different types of contracts. And sometimes people think, oh, you know, I daren't ask a question. I think I'm going to be difficult, or I might seem stupid, you know, if it's something that's missing and I just can't see it. Please don't do that. The only thing I would say is, please, before you ask a question, please read all the questions that have gone in before. If you're a buyer, and particularly here the council, it's a bit annoying if they get the same question, you know, 2 or 3 times over, and somebody's actually already asked and been responded to earlier on. However, on the other side, buyers can make mistakes. And, you know, it's with the best will in the world, very busy process in procurement, so something might get missed. There might be a slightly wrong reference to something in a document. So if in doubt, get your question in, and at least you're clear then what you need to do. Next slide, please. So on PCST, the message tab is where you can do that. The first part is create the message. The second one is receiving messages. So obviously, if you're working on the portal, you can be logging in and checking these, but they will be emailed to whoever the named, whatever that named email address is that you've used. Those will come through automatically as and when the council answers anything. Really, it's usually on a one-by-one basis. However, be aware that when it does come through, it will come through from an email address called, I think it's autoalert@bravosolution.co.uk. So it doesn't obviously look like PCST. It obviously doesn't come direct from Renfrewshire Council. So absolutely, you must keep an eye on any of those emails and open them up immediately, because the answer to other people's questions might have quite a big impact on how you want to complete your response as well. This tab has obviously a list of the sent messages. Now that's ones that you've sent, and draft messages where you've maybe prepared a draft and you don't quite want to send it yet. And then some messages, I think there is a possibility to forward some of these, although I have to say, frankly, I've not actually used that particularly myself. There is a quick question again from Lorna, where we're just talking about submitting an application to tender. She's asked if you could have it reviewed and awarded, but then decline the contract. I think that is open to everyone. It won't place you in very good stead, I guess, with the council, because they will have wanted to make sure, you know, you've ticked the box to say that you've agreed to the terms and conditions. You've ticked the box to see that you've read everything and you understand everything. So to come back and decline, I think you would want to have a very good reason for that. The only place I've seen that happen is where the buyer has been very vague about something on their side, and that's, or sort of refused to give full details. So people have said, well, we're just going to bid and then we'll deal with it later. Next slide, please, Elizabeth. So, as I say, we'll come back in the demo to actually filling in the forms. But when it comes to submitting, if you come back to this, these main ITT details setting, by that stage, you'll be able to see your qualification, your technical and your commercial response. And at that point, it shouldn't say missing anything. It should say questions all answered. And at that point, you can then click the submit response button. And you'll get an email through to whatever the email address is, just confirming that you've done that. And you'll also be able to see in the dashboard that you have in PCST confirmation that you've submitted your response. Now, there are situations, maybe you've submitted quite a bit earlier than the deadline and something comes up, or maybe somebody in your team has suddenly remembered that you wanted to add maybe something quite important to your response. After you've submitted, there is a possibility as soon as you log in and start working on the response again, it will ask you if you want to keep your changes, keep or discard. And if you say keep your changes, it will let you save what you've added and then you can resubmit. And you can do that at any stage up to the deadline. However, don't leave it literally hours before or whatever, just in case there's any system issues. Next slide, please. And just very quickly then, after you have submitted, it's important to notice, obviously there's an evaluation procedure which the council has to go through. It could be, I think you'll be able to ask about that, or it probably will be in the documents. There might be a time scale for this, and there might be, you know, likely award dates already kind of estimated, usually a month rather than the actual date necessarily. But before any awards are made, there's usually what they call a clarification request for document stage. And any requests for that will come to you via the portal. And also you'll get an alert email from this auto alert. Now, this is an area which is quite difficult. And we've had lots of clients who've done the tender, sat back, kind of got on with all your busy lives, restart again, and they forget to watch out for these. And I've had at least one who was awarded a contract and didn't notice it. And we've had others who've been asked for information and didn't provide it on time and got into quite hot water because they nearly got taken out of the procedure because they hadn't responded in time. Looking at this tender, I think a large amount of the evidence will already, you're being asked to upload it at the time of tender. So that's actually quite straightforward, I would say. However, there's sometimes always additional clarifications that might come through, so please watch out for those. And as I say, the award decision letters will also be sent via PCST. It won't be a direct email to your named contact. Next slide, please, Leslie. I think that might be us coming to the demo. So I think shall I try and share my screen again and see how we do sign in? And this is the projects list here. So click on ITTs. And this is where we get the ITTs open to all suppliers, the big long list. So the filter box is here with project code, contains, let's see my notes, 24827. Now, when I do this, it's not going to show any results because I've already gone through this process and it's now sitting in the My ITT section. But normally you'll get that link, click on the title, and then it'll be in this section. So you can see 24827 and it's sitting at the top of my interest list here. So I'll click on that. And this is now taking us into the main screen. I've already clicked on intend to respond, so I don't need to add that in, and it's already pulled up here my settings, buyer attachments, my response, associated users. It's sitting by default now at my response, which is the qualification technical commercial. The buyer attachments is there. I'm not going to go through that again because I think we've seen already. And the messages is there. So you can see I can already go in there and check. There's unread 14 to check for me there. So let's just concentrate on the 3 sections here that need to be filled in. So qualification. And before I go into the questions here, it's important to notice at the top here, you've got a Save Changes button, cancel if you put, you just want to sort of cancel what you've done, and then Save and Exit will take us back to that summary page again. If you start filling in the forms on PCST and you maybe get diverted for whatever reason, I think it's about 15 to 20 minutes of inactivity. If you haven't saved your changes at all, anything that you've typed in will just turn to blank again. And I speak from painful experience of having done this on quite a few times. So as you go through, because these forms are quite long, every so often click on Save Changes, and annoyingly it's going to bring you up to the top of the form each time, but at least it means that you're not losing things as you go through. And also at the top here, there's a little Validate Response button, and if you click on that, that will highlight any of the mandatory fields that haven't been filled in. Mandatory ones are these ones with the asterisk here. Having said that, some fields are not mandatory, but they will still, if you like, have to be filled in. The mandatory fields for PCST are ones where if you don't fill it in, it physically won't let you submit your application. Okay, so there's some questions early on in the qualification just about confirming you've read the guide. But you can see already from the screens here, they're quite detailed, and in general, everything's numbered, but some of the text here is just instructions. It's not something to fill in. So you'll see here note details, but then you're starting to move down the form, and because I've submitted quite a number of tenders already, all of intense details are pre-filled in. Otherwise, you may be doing this for your first time and it'll all be blank, so you'll need to fill these in and just save them as you go along. Okay, so most of this is just open text boxes, and this is what we call part 1 of the form. Talks about parent companies and so on. This is part 2, so it asks whether you're micro, small, and so on. There's a question, an odd question here about official lists, and the option here is not applicable. I'm UK business. And then former participation. So you can see in a previous bid, I've been bidding with partners. So if you are, then it asks you for some details that you have to fill in. But if the question's no, then you just move on to the next section. They ask for a representative of the bidder, which is generally the kind of key director, if you like, decision maker. And then there's some, again, the wording here is very, I think it was originally European wording, somehow translated into a kind of English, but the wording is very standard, unfortunately, which is why some of the SPD questions can be a wee bit tricky. Do you rely on the capacity of other entities to meet the selection criteria? The only reason you would say yes to this is if perhaps you were bidding, say, as a consortium, and I don't know, I'm trying to think of example. I can't think of any example. I think the council would maybe confirm if this is the case, because I don't think you can't bid relying on somebody else's Care Inspectorate certificate or level, whatever. So here I would expect you'd probably say no. And I think that here, for example, there's no minimum turnover. That's another reason maybe why you would rely on somebody else. Do you intend to subcontract? You might say yes to that. Again, I think it's probably unlikely, in which case your subcontractors have to fill in a separate small SPD form. So section 2, just be aware of that, and you might have some questions back to the council if you're in any form of consortium. I was just, my partner associate and I are doing some work with Scottish Enterprise at the moment, and we're looking at consortium bidding. And a very interesting example of a consortium is a group called Granite Care, who are based up in Aberdeenshire, and they've bid as the single supplying organisation to Aberdeenshire Council and Aberdeen City for all of the care at home work. But that consortium includes, I think, at least 6 partners of the main providers in the area. So they have decided to come together as a group as the best way to provide the cover that the council's looking for. So on to part 3. This is what I would call, these yes/no questions. Conspiracy. So all of these you would expect to be answering no to. There's a couple of yeses buried in the middle, which is, do you pay your taxes? Have you paid your taxes? And have you paid all your social security? But in general, the responses should be no. And if it is a yes, then you will be asked for these, a bit of self-cleaning evidence, if you like, just to make sure that would be discretionary, if you like, up to the council if they accepted that. Okay, but you can see how daunting this form looks simply just because it's absolutely so long. If you have bid before, some of your yes/no answers might already be filled in. In previous days, this used to be a Word form, so you can imagine how awful that was to fill in. And for some reason, these ones, misrepresentation at the bottom, they're never filled in, so you're left to add those back in yourself. It looks awful, but should be quite. Part 4 is the one where we're talking about the example projects, and also some questions about the staffing. Let me slowly come back down to here.
Okay, we're not seeing your screen anymore, Jill, if you want to just pop that back up.
Okay. Right. So we're still in the qualification section. Economic and financial standing is one of the questions here, and in particular, there's insurance requirements, so that is important. And again, in general, normally for procurement, you either have to have it now or commit to having it before award. I do notice there's, in the technical part, you are asked to upload, so it might be that you need to have, a letter from a broker saying that yes, you can get this cover if needed. And there's a Dun & Bradstreet check as well. So the part 4, I think the main thing for filling in really is this part, technical and professional ability. And it notes, I think as well, that there's a template to be used. So the technical experience document, and this is under the buyer attachments tab. Minimum 2, so 2 is what you would be sort of pass-fail score on, and there's some guidance here as to what needs to be covered. It does say quite clearly here, obviously if the requirements aren't met, obviously you'll be excluded at this stage. So this is very important to get these projects properly done. Okay, and hopefully you can hear me then, and we're now on to the qualifications side. So again, all the information is given on the minimum requirements for that. So I'm just going to save and exit from the qualification. It always gives you a pop-up button saying, did you mean to do that? And it will bring us back to the. You can see as we'll go through the technical one. I'm not going. Yeah, just starting to show now. Yeah, that's great. So just to finish off really on we obviously had a look at how to get into the tender, how to get to that My Response summary. The technical section will be laid out in exactly the same way as what we've looked at for qualification. And you will have a mixture of text boxes to fill in, yes, no questions, but there will be a number of questions where you have to upload documents in response. So some of these might require 1 or 2 or 3 or more documents for one response. So the important thing to know is that PCS Tender will only let you upload one document, so to speak. So if you have multiples, you'll have to use what we call a zip file. If anyone's not sure about how to create a zip file, I think I've got some slides, Elizabeth, I'll upload, and we can send them out if that's something that you've not done before. But other than that, again, the technical one is definitely one where you're going to be going in and out, you know, over the next period to fill in things. So just to be sure to remember to save. When you come to submit, if you have uploaded a document, you need to open it up and just double check that what you've uploaded is the correct thing. I would always advise that you create in your working folder, have a subfolder called upload, and only put in there the final versions of all the documents that you want to add into the portal. Otherwise, it's very easy when you're looking to upload something that you might click on, you know, a document that's got the right title, but it isn't actually the finished version. And again, that would lead to lower marks as well. So a lot of checking's needed before you submit, so leave plenty time. And the commercial one, in a sense, it's very straightforward for this tender, because I see that you've been given a fixed hourly rate, but there are a number of questions that are being asked aside from you agreeing that that is the rate to be paid, that you still have to fill in the commercial section as well. So make sure that you read through those and be ready with the information that you need for that as well. Okay, so, and in general, I've added in a few tips really just at the end, and I suppose just going back to my original recommendation that you absolutely need to read all of the documents. To be honest, I quite often even just handwrite some of the key requirements as I'm going through and then transfer that into my bid plan. And it's things to do with formats, with font sizes. I quickly identify if I need to be getting any information, you know, that I don't have to hand from other teams, or maybe I need insurance documents and so on. And I also, as I'm going through, identify things that I'm not sure about where I might want to ask a question. The second advice I would say is to have a look and sort of try to work on this as a team. There's a bit of a tendency sometimes that maybe 1 or 2 people end up with this horrible tender to do and everyone else shuts them in the office and leaves them to it. The best scoring answers, in my experience, come where people have worked as a team and they draw on your frontline staff. They check the teams for what's our day-to-day practice, what have been the challenges. Those project examples that you're being asked for ask you to provide, you know, innovative practice, added value practice. So all of that, you know, the more you can draw on the people in the front line, the better, I would say. And that helps you provide evidence. So don't write things that say, we're fantastic, you know, it's opinions, we're person-centred, the highest value you can imagine, da, 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 da. It needs to be backed up with, well, here's why, and here's how we can prove that, and here's the feedback, and so on. And if you can, try and allocate questions, you know, amongst different people, but agree some clear deadlines in your bid plan for drafting, reviewing, final submission. And obviously, I think Lorna was asking about, you know, can you maybe decline the contract? That might be on legal terms. So make sure that you get legal or your director's view on any of the tricky issues early on. Next slide, Elizabeth, just the last one. When it does come to writing, those technical questions where you've got, like a 3-page or a 2-page limit, those can be quite challenging, but you don't necessarily want to write to that limit initially. What I would tend to do is treat it a wee bit like a school exam and do a writing plan and just make notes, read the ITT and say, right, question 1, what are all the things that we think we need to mention to make sure that we answer all the points in the question? What evidence do we have? What's our added value? So, in this sector, it could be that everybody's answers are a little bit the same, I have to say, because the process is quite similar. What is it that you're doing that adds the value, that does it differently better? And particularly from, what's the benefit for the Renfrewshire Council team in terms of what they've asked for? So personalise it to the council and what they're particularly looking for, as opposed to a generic answer. And then just include your company name, obviously, on all attached documents. Okay, I think that's probably the last one, Elizabeth, I remember. So just come back